Thank you, Lord, for those. Thank you, Lord, for those who can sing, play music that points our hearts and our affections, our minds, our thinking to the place and the source of our peace and our rest. Thank you so much for those reminders. And Lord, this morning as we just share for a few minutes together, I ask you that you would once again just communicate your heart to us, your thoughts, that we would be able to believe and respond. In your precious name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. Hey guys, before you're seated, would you thank our musicians and our singers? So I leaned over to my wife and I said, does it just sound like the singing is so much louder? And it just seems that you guys are really participating. I heard most of it from over here. So if that was you singing your heart out, can I see your hand if you're on this side of the room and you were singing your heart out? On this side of the room, you got a lot of work to do, because I didn't hear anything over there, but it was awesome. It was just like really, really cool to hear that. Sounded like the whole choir was just engaged, so it's wonderful. My name is Bernard, and I'm the lead pastor here at the Collective. I want to just say thank you, because 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you have access to many, many voices and many, many different people who can speak into your life. And this morning, you chose to be here in this place at this time. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak something that I believe will help you. And but you do have to make the choice to engage while you're here and to be present, or you can you might miss something that's important. So last week, we started a conversation about entering God's rest. And I want to continue that conversation today. And we're going to start where we started last week, and I'm just going to review for a few minutes. And that is in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3. It says this. It says, God's promise of entering his rest still stands. And so we ought to tremble with fear that some of you might fail to experience it. Stop there. And it's just saying that every single person in this room has the opportunity to enter his rest. And we ought to really, really take it seriously that one of us might leave this room and miss out on experiencing God's rest. Verse 2. For this good news of God's rest, his promise that God has prepared this rest has been announced to us just as it was announced to them. But it did them no good because they did not share the faith of those who listened to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. Can you say those words with me? For only we who believe can enter his rest. Now, picking up from last week, the question that we wanted to ask last week and try to approach was, what is God's rest? Because it's not R.I.P., rest in peace. That's what we say to dead people when they physically die, rest in peace, Pastor Bernard. This is not what he's talking about. And it's not talking about, God's rest is not, I don't have to work anymore, I can just go on vacation and rest and relax. It's not talking about that kind of rest. So what is this rest of, what is it to enter God's rest? What is God's rest? And how do I enter God's rest? And what hinders me from entering God's rest? And that's what we covered last week. And I want to summarize what God's rest is by one phrase, and it's this. It's believing his promises of his presence and his provision for every moment of your everyday. Let me repeat that. Entering his rest, or God's rest, is his promise of his presence and his provision in your life every moment of every day. That is God's rest. And so when God promises you, do not fear, for I am with you. We enter that promise by believing. He says, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. But only those who believe can enter into the strength of Jesus and experience God's rest. What about, do not worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about what you will wear. Don't worry about provision. Papa has you covered. Have you entered into the rest of those promises? Because entering God's rest is entering into His promises by believing what He says is true. And only we who believe can enter His rest. For we see that they could not enter His rest because of their unbelief. And so the challenge for all of us is entering into. And I want to say to you that His rest is a mindset. His rest is a consciousness. His rest is an awareness of His presence. His rest is a lifestyle. It is a new way of living and breathing and moving in Him. This is the life that we are promised. That it doesn't mean that we have ceased to work. It doesn't mean that we have ceased from activity, but we go about our lives in a different kind of way. We do it from His rest, not for His rest. And let me say very clearly, you cannot earn God's rest. You enter His rest, and only we who believe can enter His rest. Now, His promise still stands. His promise is for you. 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 That was 4 women that I pointed out. Rama, his promise is for you. His promise is for you, Mark. His promise of entering His rest for you, Tim. It's a personal promise, and that's where I want to pick up this morning. It's in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. And Jesus says these words. He says, then Jesus said, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you. Come on, say it. Rest. I want you to notice it's come to me. It's not come to a religion. It's not come to church. It's not come to a philosophy. It's not come to a worldview. It's not come to Christianity. It's not come to something. It's come to me. It's come to me. Christ's personal invitation to you. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. There's no qualifications. The only qualifications given in the invitation is if you are weary and heavy laden. Is there an area of your life this morning where you are weary, you are tired? It's burdensome. And Jesus' invitation, and remember last week I said that it's a series of invitation. God invites, God initiates, the human beings respond to that promise. We believe His promise. We respond to the invitation. And once again, we're confronted this morning with another personal invitation, because the promise is for today. And guess what? When you get up tomorrow will be today. And it will be the same invitation for you to enter His rest, because His rest is a mindset. His rest is believing His promises of His presence and His provision for your every moment of your everyday life. What would life be like without worry? What would your life look like without fear? What would it look like if it was lived out of rest. And so in verse 28, he says, come to me. It's a personal invitation. In verse 29, he says this, take my yoke upon you and let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart. I'll just stop there and leave it up on the screen. But a yoke was this piece of wood that was placed between two animals that would help them work together as a team to thresh the field or to plow the field. Now, how many of you know that Jesus was a carpenter? And he would thank you. You paid attention in Sunday school. They were like raising their hand. Jesus was a carpenter. That was the family business. And he was dragged into the family business. How many of you have been dragged into the family business? No one wants to raise their hand. Matt, oh, you were dragged into the family business. Okay, cool. Anyway, had nothing to do with the sermon. Okay, so Jesus is a carpenter, and one of the things that he would do is he would receive orders from people to make yokes. And so when he says, come to me and my yoke is easy, he made quite a few yokes in his day. And this yoke that he's asking you is so that he could work together with you as a team to do life with you. He wants to be your life coach. Learn of me. Let me teach you. Do you see it up on the screen? Let me teach you, for I am gentle and humble at heart. I don't stand over you. I don't point my finger. I don't scream and yell at you. But we do life together. Let me be your coach. Many of us have these images of this tyrant and this ruler and this king, and he just dictates and he makes edicts. Jesus is a different kind of king, one who is humble and gentle. And what is Jesus' personal invitation? I want to do life with you. I want to teach you. Wherever you are, and we have so many different people in so many different spheres of community and social, all kinds of different careers and places in life. And it's the same invitation. Come to me. I want to do life with you. I want to be your coach. Take my yoke upon you. You know, and he says this yoke is light. It fits perfectly. It's like a new pair of shoes. Have you ever gone to the store and you try a pair of shoes on and you thought they were your size, but they're just rubbing against this or they're rubbing against that, and it's just awkward and it hurts? Have you ever purchased a pair of shoes that did not fit when you got home? How many of you brought those shoes back to the store and got your money back or got a different size? Can I see your hand? 2 hands. How many of you were too embarrassed to go back to the store because you felt stupid for picking the wrong pair and it didn't fit your foot? Jesus is saying, my yoke fits. And when you do life with me, I want you to do life with me. I want to coach you. Now, in the immediate context of Jesus speaking these words, his listeners, his original audience were Jews. Many of them were farmers, fishermen, peasants, poor people. He says, I have come to preach the good news to the poor. And he's preaching to poor people. And he's offering this rest, and he's offering this. And we have to understand that probably no one in this room understands the weight and the burden of Jewish religion, Jewish law, the regulations, and the weight and the burden that would have on a human being. And Jesus' original audience were Jews who were trying their best to follow a law. And not only was it the 10 Commandments that some of us are familiar with, but the teachers of religious law had added on to those original 10, and there was something in the neighborhood of 600 and something, laws for people. Thou shalt not, you don't do this, don't do that, don't go there. And we pick this up later in Matthew's gospel. This is Jesus talking about those religious leaders and the weight and the burden and the heaviness that people would feel. And he says this, Jesus said to the crowds, this is on a different occasion, but he said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees are the official interpreters of the law of Moses. So practice and obey what they tell you, but don't follow their example, for they don't practice what they teach. They crush people. They crush people. They crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. This is what religion does to human beings. It crushes them under the demands of religious obligations. My heart breaks when I meet Christians who find the Christian life mainly duties, obligation, heavy, guilt, condemnation, fear. It breaks my heart instead of us understanding that when Jesus calls us to a personal relationship and into relationship, he's not talking about crushing religious demands. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And when you do life with me, so many people are crushed under the burden of never being enough, never doing enough, never serving enough, never reading enough, never praying enough, never fasting enough, never doing enough. And the weight of that makes you weary. And the weight of that makes you walk away from faith. And the weight of that makes you walk away from community. Why? Because you're heavy burdened and you're weary from religion. And I want to say again, Jesus doesn't invite you to a religion. He invites you to a personal relationship. And if one person could say amen, it would do something deep down in my soul. There's another kind of weariness or burden for us, because for most of us, we're not under the weight of Judaism or the Jewish law or the law of Moses. There is another kind of weariness to life and burdens that we carry, and that is because of the choices that you made and the choices that other people in your life have made for you or have affected you in some way. And this also leaves you weary and burdened. Because oftentimes your choices and choices of others around you, those choices cause pain. Those choices cause heartache. Those choices can leave you abandoned, can leave you weary. Oftentimes, and everyone in this room, you're here by a series of choices. And just think of how many choices you made just to get your rear end here this morning. And oftentimes, the choices that we have made and the choices that other people have made have caused us pain. They have caused suffering. They have caused heartache. And you sit here this morning and you are weary from the consequences of the series of decisions that were made by you and by others. And when you're a parent and your children are making choices, and your grown children or your young adult children, every parent has felt the sting, and I'm speaking from experience. And we have made choices. People have made choices, and it leaves us weary. It leaves us in pain. Oftentimes, these consequences lead to dark times in our life. And Jesus is speaking to you this morning, all of you who are weary and heavy burdened, come to me and I will give you rest. I don't think anyone sitting in the room is exempt from hardship and pain and suffering. Some of us have lost close people to us to death or disease. Some, it's been the relational aspect, marriage, infidelity, abandonment, divorce, separation. Children have passed. Parents have passed. And oftentimes it's in these times that the invitation comes to us. Because tomorrow will be today. And today is the invitation to come and to enter my rest. Now, as most of you, I have gone through some dark times in my life, in my experience. I've made some poor choices. Poor choices have been made to affect me. And one of the things that has helped me is a poem that was written some 80 years ago. And there's some argument and some debate on who actually wrote the poem, but I don't really care who wrote it. It's just beautiful. It has helped me, and I hope that it will help you. Something called Footprints in the Sand, and I want to read you that poem this morning to remind everyone in the room. One night I dreamed a dream, the poem says. As I was walking along the beach with my Lord, across the dark sky flashed scenes from my life. And for each scene, I noticed that there were two sets of footprints in the sand on the beach. One belonged to me, and the other belonged to my Lord. After the last scene of my life flashed before me, I looked back at the footprints in the sand, and I noticed that at many times along my journey, especially at the very lowest and saddest times, there was only one set of footprints. This really troubled me, and so I asked the Lord about it. Lord, you said that once I decided to follow you, you'd walk with me all the way. But I noticed that during the saddest and most troublesome times of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why, when I needed you the most, you abandoned me. And the Lord whispered and said, my child, my precious child, I love you, and I would never leave you, never ever during your trials and testings. When you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. Oftentimes when we're going through the hard times, when we're going through the earthquake moments in our life, it is easy to feel like we're all alone. And we feel the effect of that. And we feel like we're carrying it, and it leaves us weary and heavy burdened because we feel like we're doing it all by ourselves. As a gentle reminder this morning, as you look back at the scenes of your life, and maybe the darkest and saddest times of your life, it's a reminder that when you thought you were all alone, it was a time that He carried you. Jesus, I pray that whoever is weary and whoever's heavy burdened this morning, that we'd answer that call, that we would respond to you, that we'd enter into your rest. I pray, Jesus, that not a single person would leave this room having failed to experience the rest that you give from weariness and our burdens of life. I also want to extend and help us see something else. Not only are we called to rest in Him, but I believe that we are also called to partner with Christ in bringing rest, and out of our experience of His rest, to be His hands and His feet and His mouth, and extending that grace and that rest to other people. And we read about this in Galatians chapter 6, And it says this. It says, "Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path, and be careful not to fall into the same temptation yourself." Verse 2. Here it is. Share each other's burdens, and in this way, obey the law of Christ. So sharing each other's burdens is obeying the law of Christ, and we'll come right back to what is the law of Christ. Because he says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." So what is the law of Christ? Because some way of fulfilling the law of Christ, it is by sharing one another's burdens and being the hands and feet of Jesus and partnering with Jesus. In verse 3, he says, "If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important." Can everybody say slap? So no one in the room is too important to help someone else. And somehow, by sharing someone else's burden with them, we're fulfilling the law of Christ. And so we come back to the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? The law of Christ is found in John chapter 13 when Jesus is teaching his disciples. In verse 34, it says, "So I am now giving you a new commandment. Love each other." But there's a qualification of this love each other, because Rama could leave this room and he could have his own interpretation of what it means to love. And Mark could leave this room and he'll have his own interpretation of love, because we have so many different definitions and so many different perspectives of what it means to love. But Jesus qualifies that it's to love one another just as I have loved you. You should love each other. A part of that, part of loving each other just as Christ has loved you, is entering into and carrying and sharing the load of someone's life and entering into that place. In verse 35, it says, "Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." I want to say the invitation this morning is not only to come to him to find that rest and that peace and that and doing life with him as he's coaching you. I also want to say, please open up your heart and respond to him and say, "Jesus, I am available. Jesus, I want to partner with you. I know that relationships are difficult and life is difficult and people around me have pain and suffering, and somehow I'm called not only in my own sphere, but I'm also called to those around me to share their burdens, to be the hands and feet of Christ, to be your voice, to be the shoulder to cry on, to be the person who walks through pain and suffering and disappointment and discouragement and the joys and the valleys and the tears and the laughs together." It's an invitation to partner with him. And so I want to bring this back full circle, back to Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. As the invitation comes to you this morning, a personal invitation. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Today, if you hear his voice, believe. Today, if you hear his voice, respond. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." I want you to just close your eyes for a moment. It's not because it's holy, it's not because it's a religious thing to do. It just limits the distractions around you. And so, Jesus, your promise comes to us, your voice speaking to the hearts of your people, your sons and your daughters all across this room, to come to you that we might find rest. For those who have gone through and are going through a dark period, I pray that they would understand that you are with them, that you are carrying them and sustaining them through dark times of their life. But you also place us in community that we can share one another's burdens. Lord, I pray that not a single person in this room would miss out on entering into your promise, your rest. Come to me, all you who are weary, and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Lord, I pray that every single person would experience that, would enter into your rest by believing that whatever their burden and whatever they're carrying, that heartache, that weight of responsibility, that weight of guilt, that weight of resentment, that weight that's so heavy upon their shoulders, that they would give it to you today, Lord, that they might exchange the burden, that they would exchange the weariness for your life and your strength. Lord, thank you so much for bringing us to this place. Help us to respond now. We say, just like that father in the story, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. Lord, I want to respond. I want to open my heart to you. I want to experience your rest. I want to lay down this burden. I want to lay down this weariness. I'm so tired. But I know there's people around, and I'm ashamed to cry. I'm ashamed to be emotional. But here I am, and I know you see my heart, and I know you see my tears, and I know you see my burden, and I know you see my weariness. And if it's okay with you, Jesus, I just want to keep it between you and me this morning. Because you know how bad I hurt inside. And Jesus, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. But all I know is I've heard your voice this morning say, "Come to me, my precious child, and I will give you rest for your soul." And Jesus, something deep inside of me wants to experience that rest because I'm so tired. I'm so tired. I feel so lost.